Ammar Abdulhamid, who's the founder of the Thowra Foundation, not the Thowra Foundation, but things may change, the title may change. And on my right, we will have Radwan Ziadeh, who's a member of the Syrian National Council and a founder of the Damascus Center for Human Rights, both in Washington, D.C., and just paying very close attention to what's going on. So while we wait for Radwan, when I turn to you, and maybe you can start.
Thank you very much for the invitation. I think we've all been following the news as far as developments in the region is concerned, and probably months ago no one would have expected that something along these lines would be happening in the region, but it is. And I'm not going to delve sort of right now into the causality of it, because that's really sort of a big question that will be debated for many years. But let me focus right now on the particular developments in Syria and since the beginning of the revolution and where we are right now. Basically, this revolution started as a peaceful protest movement, and for the most part it remains peaceful. But over the last 8 to 12 weeks, we've really seen a degree of militarization of the revolution, especially in the central part of Syria and the northern part of Syria. But also now it has spillovers even in the Damascene countrysides and also in the south part of Syria. And the reasons for that kind of turn into militarization is really the intensive oppression that the peaceful protesters have really been subjected to. I mean, we've seen several Tiananmen Square type moments with people facing tanks, but instead of having the tanks actually swerving left or right or avoiding firing at people, these tanks and the drivers of these tanks had no problem firing into the residential areas, no problem killing the protesters. So when you have a regime, as I was talking to Professor Picasting, is when you have a regime that cannot be shamed, that doesn't care about its image, that doesn't care about its public image, neither inside the country nor outside, and only cares about its limited support base. And as long that they can still derive support from that particular sets of communities, then they really don't give a damn about all other factors. And when they can count on unquestionable or unquestioning support from Iran, and they can count on a Russian sort of Chinese veto, and they can count also on some kind of logistical support from Hezbollah and these kind of groups, then they really don't care about issues of public image and reputation and whatever. So that is one element that has always been our mind when we started this revolution, is that, you know, we knew that we are dealing with shameless people who have dealt with impunity for a long period of time with the internal situation, and people who cannot be shamed, and people who cannot be pressured really, and not even economically really, as we have seen. So how can we maintain that peaceful character of the protest? So now we realize that you know, the nonviolence definitely has reached its limitations, because the conditions for successful implementation of that kind of struggle are not met within the Syrian circumstances. And a lot of people are beginning to see from their own experiences, not anymore on the basis of any kind of academic considerations, but their own experiences have shown them that nonviolent resistance is not working. So a lot of people in different communities in Syria are now turning toward the defectors and the increasing role of the defectors and organizing something called the Free Syrian Army, and the role of that army in trying to protect the different protest communities. Of course, the problem is with that situation is that this army is not receiving any outside support. It's still a project in motion. A lot of the members are in the army are really civilians who joined it and joined the defectors and are working under them. And it has not been endorsed politically by any of the opposition groups. In fact, the major opposition coalitions that have emerged, especially the Syrian National Council, that's really acquiring a lot of attention lately, refused to endorse it, refused to endorse the defectors. In fact, they condemn defections, and that's creating a division in the street that's very serious. So the revolutionary movement started with a lot of promise. and a certain commitment and a certain naivete in some of the aspirations. But now they are hitting into realities, and they are. It's getting to be more and more divided, and along ideological lines, but also along tactical lines. What is the best tactics to adopt and to implement? And it seems to me, therefore, that the Assad are sitting pretty confident right now. They have, and every day we are witnessing really a massacre. Now the death toll averages between 20 to 25 a day over the last, almost 8 weeks. The situation is is really transforming from bad to worse. As far as the human cost is concerned, despite the fact that the Turkish Prime Minister at one point was willing to come up and say we will not allow another Hama during the election, and well, a few days after his statements, another Hama did take place. The troops went into Hama, but it was sort of like a symbolic second Hama, because they didn't commit sort of the major massacres that they committed in 1982, but they still managed to get back control of the city. The second Hama is happening in Homs, actually. This is where the conditions are very similar to what happened in 1982 in Hama. The tanks are in the street, they're bombing residential neighborhoods. If you go to YouTube, or if you go to my blog, basically, where I try to collect all of these videos for you and comment on them, put them together, you can see actually that in Homs over the last few weeks there have been continuous bombardment of residential neighborhoods in the center of the city. This is the center of the rebellion, basically, and we're talking about serious warfare here. And the problem is, the number of defectors don't justify that kind of violence anyway, and there haven't been any clashes, in fact, between loyalists and defectors in Homs city. The clashes are taking part in the countryside, where defectors have the ability to adopt guerrilla warfare tactics, sort of like hit and run. But Homs city itself has not witnessed that kind of violence on part of defectors. So you really wonder, what are the loyalists doing? Whom are they bombarding? What's the point beyond shelling residential neighborhoods? So it's a terror campaign, really, that's taken place. The world is watching. We hear occasional condemnations, but that's it. I mean, threats of increased economic sanctions, but nothing else. The geopolitical situation is not helping the revolution. Really, everybody is afraid of change in Syria because it impacts Turkish interests, it impacts Iraqi interests, Israeli interests, Lebanese interests, Jordanian interests, Saudi interests, Qatari interests. Everybody seems to be, and in fact, even Indian interests, South African interests. Every regional power right now or global power that wants to struts its stuff basically on the international scene seems to have an interest right now in Syria and how the situation develops. And all of these interests don't seem to coincide with the interests of the Syrian people and their aspiration for freedom. So the Syrian people are really fighting against all odds, and the international community that was willing to cry foul and push for NATO intervention in Libya long before the forces of Muammar Gaddafi reached Benghazi, and when the death toll was only 100, and when the revolution has already taken an armed insurrection character. You didn't hear the Western leaders basically condemn sort of the armed nature of the revolution, but now you hear them sort of admonishing the Syrians, don't carry weapons, as if it's by choice, as if it's natural for people to take all the kind of violence against them and not want to defend themselves. So the reality is, you've seen a lot of hypocrisy on part of the international community in the way they are dealing with the internal situation. A lot of the people in the opposition, because of their own ideological predilections as leftists and Islamists and their suspicion of the West, they don't adopt the kind of interventionist calls, which is very strange, because the people in the street have been carrying banners saying, look, we want no-fly zone, we want international protection, we want support for the Free Syrian Army, we want safe haven. So they are actually detailing what is it that they want. But the opposition groups, the SNC, have so far failed to endorse these commitments. They are calling, generally speaking, for protection of civilians, but they did not adopt the specifics. They are still debating that, and they're debating the leadership structure and so on. So the reality is, it's everybody, the Syrian people are feel that they are really being let down. There's a lot of frustration. right now. There is a lot of anger, and you know, for a long time, basically, opposition groups talked among each other that it's a matter of time, that's it, the situation can never go back to the way it used to be, or, you know, it's changed, everything has changed. The reality is nothing has changed. Times and worse, yeah, in a sense, because once the Assad emerges victorious, he's going to owe a lot of debts to all of the forces that kept him in place. The sectarian tendencies are going to increase. He has to reward all of these militias that he recruited. He has to stand by his allies. So you know, the situation is going to become even worse as far as a lot of Syrians are concerned. So I think we've been dealing with the situation, therefore, with some kind of arrogance when we're thinking that the situation cannot somehow go back to what it used to be, or that we can somehow emerge victorious just because we broke the barrier of fear. Breaking the barrier of fear is important, but we have to also break the barrier of ideological squibbling among the opposition. We have to be able to become more organized on the ground. We have to be able to become more pragmatic in order to sustain a momentum of the revolution. We have to be able to realize that we are now dealing with a two-tier revolution, peaceful in some parts, violent in other, and that it's okay. We have to be able to get the international community to adopt a more proactive stance, and that requires a greater level of involvement on part of the opposition and a greater clarity of purpose on part of the opposition in dealing with the international community. I don't see that happening anytime soon. So the reality is the situation in Syria, in my assessment, is, and I'm saying this, you know, from the point of view of an analyst, is heading towards a situation of prolonged low-intensity conflict. This is not a situation that's going to be resolved in a month or two, or even a year or two, and unless there is a drastic change in the international situation. Personally, that's disastrous. I mean, I am heavily invested in this, like Radwan and others. You know, the emotional toll on us is really almost paralyzing. But and making that kind of an objective assessment is, or trying to be objective, is really very difficult. But the reality is, we have to be able to put the facts on the table and be clear about them in order for us to manage that situation and get it where we want to go. The situation is bleak. The revolution is in danger. It's very clear that we have no sense of direction, no sense of leadership, and the international community is not supportive, regardless of the rhetoric, who gives a damn about rhetoric. And the Assads seem to be positioned to emerge from this crisis, if you read the facts as they are right now, victorious. So unless the opposition and those players in the international community who want to see a positive change in Syria, who want to see a regime change in Syria, unless they review their tactics, they review their ideas, they review their strategies, they review their stances, and adopt more effective ways of dealing with the situation, and frankly realize that intervention is needed, we are going to see the end of this revolution pretty soon, as far as the losing momentum, and we're going to say, as I said, the situation will turn into a low-intensity conflict that will be manageable for the Assads, unless, as I said, the drastic situation, on the international level really change. But it's a bleak assessment at this stage, and it's hard tension for me to be able to, or to have to make that kind of assessment. But this is how I see facts at this stage.
Well, thank you very much. You should have been a few minutes more late because the SNC has been criticized by Ammar, so it was probably better not to be here to hear that. But anyway, you are here, and I'm delighted, and maybe hear your response and your own assessment.
Okay. Thank you very much for SAIS for organizing this. It's a great opportunity to be there with a great friend Ammar. Mostly, I will talk in a few minutes about the assessment how the Syrian revolution is going. It's clear right now that after 8 months of the peaceful demonstrations that it's reached the peak. It's gonna get the momentum. With the same time, the regime will not fall down with these peaceful demonstrations. Even that, we don't see any major crackdown among the regime. Then we have now two powers. The power of the people, which it has been 8 months of grave, peaceful demonstrations. Of course, overwhelming of the demonstrations are peaceful. With the same time, we have the full capacity of the security forces and the army, which unfortunately the army is taking side of the Assad regime rather than helping the protest, as we have seen in Tunisia or in Egypt. And this is why two powers, they are fighting each other and no one can win. The Assad or the regime itself expected that this demonstration they will be able to cool the protest, even that using the high maximum of violence against the protest. We never seen such kind of tactics of torture, only maybe in some areas of the Balkans during the civil war between the Serbs and the Bosnian. But the Assad regime is the only regime actually using some tactics against his own people, his own civilians, like actually stealing some organs from the bodies, torturing the people, and then calling the families of the mother of the one who's been tortured, that I torture your son, I break his bone, I take off his eye. This is such kind of practices which make the people, they lose their patience of non-violence protest. With the same time, using the full capacity of the army. It's not only the 4th division under supervision of his brother Maher al-Assad, but also other divisions in the army. It's true that there is a lot of defection in the army, especially in the low level, but we can say it's still 10 to 20% of the army, which is not a significant number. Those people who are defected, they can organize themselves as what happened in Libya, then start fighting the Assad militias. But at the same time, we have the will of the people. As I said before, 8 months, and which amazing not only for Syrians, for every citizen over the world will see that how they can go the street every day. Even that everyone is going to the protest, he or she will know that this is like suicide mission. He doesn't or she doesn't know that he will come back to his home or not. Because the Assad regime, he never used actually rubber, only start from live ammunition, which a huge number, of course, of arrest and detention campaign. 2 days ago, I have press conference at the UN in New York, and I said the number is approximately 30,000, which actually the arrests became nightmare for the Syrians. My brother in prison since August 30. My cousin also said it has been 82 days for him in prison, and 3 of my cousins. I have no information until now where are them right now. It has been 2 months or more, and this is, you can imagine, for one family in small city they have 5 relative members. This is why we can see that more than 30,000, the number is much higher. The Syrian regime is cancelled the football championship because they turned over all the soccer field to be detention center. The main stadium, Al-Fayhan Stadium in Damascus, the main stadium in Latakia, which is called the Assad Stadium, the main stadium in Daraa, all of them, they've been turned over to be detention and torture centers. With the same time, the schools in Homs, the cinema in Latakia. And this is, despite all of that, we'll see people, they are demonstrating. Then this is the time actually for negotiations, as we have seen in other parts of the world. But unfortunately, the Assad regime still feel that he will be able to cool the protest. he still starts repeating the same propaganda that we have the armed gangs. He added last week the Al-Qaeda, like Al-Qaddafi. We have Al-Qaeda. Suddenly we discover that all cities in Syria, they have groups of Al-Qaeda. We have cells, hidden cells in Al-Qaeda in every city and every apartment and house, because they killed one of the protesters. We discovered he's Christian, and they accused him that he's belonging to the Salafist group. I'm not joking. This is actually the official charge of George Sabra, who is a Christian activist and being accused as linked to the Salafist group. And this is why it's became difficult. But the other hand, the international community is not helping, because despite of 8 months, we cannot have only one resolution from the Security Council. The Security Council failed after the veto being practiced by Russia or China to condone what's happened in Syria, even that there is no economic sanctions, there is no refer to the crimes against the humanity to the International Criminal Court. This is why most people on the ground, they do believe now the peaceful demonstrations will not go to anywhere. We have to take arms, we have to take guns. Look what's happened in Libya. They decide after 10 days that peaceful demonstration will work with Al-Qaddafi. After 9 months, they have now, they kill Al-Qaddafi himself. And unfortunately, the example of Libya being inspired many people on the ground in Syria. Even that we do believe that taking arms in Syria is much more complicated, since we have different ethnic groups. Will may that taking arms will may that lead to the civil war. And this is why the opposition at the National Syrian Council still actually insist to be for peaceful demonstration as strategy. With the same time, we should support the soldiers and the officers, the armed officers who defected to organize themselves. Where Syria is going, it's clear that no indication that the people will go to their homes or accept the Assad as a president anymore. He has too much blood in his hand, more than 4,000 have been killed, and no one will accept. But at the same time, the regime trying to invest in the fear of the civil war. Syria, just to be sure about that, Syria has no history of civil war. Never we have civil war between different ethnic groups. And this is, of course, some will say that this is the same like with Iraq. The only concern we have actually related to the Alawite community is nothing related to the Christian, because since the Christian are actually part of the Syrian society, being actually in 1952 the Prime Minister was Faris al-Khoury, and he's a Christian and a Protestant. And the Protestant is majority of the Christian in Syria are Orthodox. He's minority of the minorities. Even that he became Prime Minister for 2 terms. The concern we have actually regarding the Alawite. The Alawite minority, they don't have extended in other countries, and they never have links to the international community like the Maroons or the Druze in Lebanon. This is why they feel that if they lose the power with the Assad regime, they will be massacred, they will be killed. And this is trying actually, with all the guarantees of the opposition and the Syrian National Council, will not work. The only actual institution can give the guarantee for the Alawite community is the Arab League. This is why we insist for a main role for the Arab League in the crisis in Syria. With the same time, if the Arab League get more tougher position toward the Assad regime, it's quite difficult for Russia and China to practice any veto, because they will be actually faced or challenged by majority of the Arabs, and this is what will be difficult for the economic interest in the region. Today should be the Arab delegation in Damascus to meet with the Assad. We met actually with the Arab League last week in Cairo. We discussed about we will not accept any dialogue, keep Assad in his position, but we do negotiate. negotiate about how he will exit and how can we move together to have democratic and civic state in the future. This is the issue. Then a few words about the role of the United States, which is really important right now. It's serious and different than in Libya. The United States has no real interest in Libya, but they have the whole interest in Syria, because keeping Syria away from Iran, you have to change the Assad regime. Bringing the stability to Iraq or Lebanon, you have to change the Assad regime. And then to have a peace also with Israel, you have to change the Assad regime, because it has more than 40 years, and the Assad is not able to make any peace negotiations with Israel. This is why we do believe that the whole interest of the United States and the West should be in change the Assad regime. The United States, as my understanding, that reached the point that the Assad has to go. And President Obama repeated that in many statements. But at the same time, the United States is not able to do anything to make this happen. It's good to say it in the statements, in the rhetoric, but we will not do anything to make this happen, since actually the Arabs is not helpful, and we don't see any in the region, any consensus among the Arabs to help us in doing that. This is why we do believe it's important now for the United States to take the leadership, first on the Security Council, to bring the Russians and the Chinese on the table to agree on the resolution, to condemn the violence, then to put sanctions on Bashar al-Assad and other security officers, with the same time refer the crimes against humanity to the International Criminal Court. The second thing, actually, which is really important, to work with the Arabs, because the Arabs, the Arab League never have a position in or they help to solve any of the crises among the Arabs themselves. The only case was Libya was an exception, because actually no one like Gaddafi is idiot, and all the Gulf countries pushed actually for him, the Emirati and the Saudi, they helped even that arming the opposition, giving them arm and the money to be sure that the Gaddafi should leave soon. But this is not the situation in Syria. But at the same time, after the Arab Spring, we do believe the Arab League should be reviewed, its charter, and should be act as a regional organization which more interest in the Arab people rather than the regime or the leader or the dictators themselves. And we do believe that if they insist on their mission on Syria, will be an open, different chapter on Syria. The third recommendation, the opposition now, it's much more organized itself through what the SNC, the Syrian National Council, despite of some of critiques of my friend Ammar maybe, or other groups, but we're still in the process actually to organize ourselves much more and to include more people as an advisors or as a members But the SNC, we can see right now, it's the most organized with the same time, which include all the ethnic and different groups inside Syria and outside Syria. Which the good thing, which actually something we different than what's happening in Iraq, or in we don't put actually the different ethnic groups, because we don't put a council depends on the sectarian lines. We don't say that 30% for the Sunni, 10% for the Alawi, 10% of Christian, because actually will create that more division among the group or among the Syrian itself, since the sectarian language is a lovely one among the Syrians. This is why we insist in the council to have different political and social groups. All these groups will come to the table, but we ask every group actually to have Kurdish representative, Christian and other minorities among this political party, which then, when, as example, the course maybe they have 10% of the Syrian population, but they reflect, depends on their qualification, and their leaders may have much more percentage in the leadership of the council. Then we don't have a council depends on the sectarian division among the Syrians, because the mistakes has been taken in Iraq, rather than we have a council depends on the qualification, depends also on the political parties and the rising leaders in the demonstrations. It's not an easy, because the popular uprising in Syria, it's nobody knows who's who and who is actually organizing the protest. It's quite difficult. This is why it takes 8 months to have the SNC, and we're still in progress. Every day we have actually to review the people. Every day we see hats, different tags, different groups of the leadership among the SNC. But at the end we have actually this solid organization which can lead to have peaceful and smooth transition in Syria. Later on, the SNC will not be responsible on any transitional period, rather than actually will open up for other groups or other political parties. It has much more representative in their groups. But this organization has only task and only goal actually to achieve the Syrian revolution, its goals, which enforce Bashar al-Assad to step down and to make the transition in Syria peaceful. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Well, I don't want to add depressing news, but I think we are in October, and October is not February or March. The world has changed considerably, and the international community doesn't exist anymore. The US is in electoral mode. Europe is in saving itself mode. Even Sarkozy is just, is running an election next year. There's no one. The only talk about the Arab League. The Arab League has always been very, very reluctant to do anything against one of its members. It only needs Saudi Arabia, which has a bit of power, but it's a very cautious regime by nature. And you talk about calls, for people to leave. The U.S. has called for President Saleh to leave a long time ago, and he sort of left, but then he came back, and he's back in the picture right now. So those calls don't really go anywhere. So I think it is really what we were talking about before. It is an internal affair, and it's going to be sort of very close to the region, which is sad but interesting as well. My question has to do with all the revolutions that have taken place so far this year. Had the military played a central role? Whether it held the departure of the dictator, whether it's split into and started fighting each other, whether it was paralyzed and eventually just, it's always the military that held the key. And what surprises me in Syria is, you mentioned defectors, both of you mentioned defections, but it's limited, still limited. And on the other hand, you have people who are committing atrocities, like full-fledged war crimes, or whatever you know to qualify them. And not only that, but those crimes are taking place not only in Syria, but even in parts of Europe. When there is intimidation of Syrian protesters, they are being bullied outside of the embassies where they protest, or wherever they protest. This is like Western capital, that what is this culture of impunity? And those who are actually doing the killing. And there's lots of footage of that. Everybody has a camera, so it's not hard to see those images of those people going in the street, just bullying the crowd, shooting at the crowd. Why is this culture of impunity? Why do you find enough people, that many people, who are they, to actually commit those atrocities? And by the way, the atrocities are just really quite horrible. I mean, it's not just shooting at a crowd, it's just personal, more physical. It looks like Chile in the 1970s.
Basically, I think, and this is where we really have to acknowledge, and where, for instance, a reference that Radwan made to the 1950s, when we had the harmony between the different communities and confessional groups was very well known and celebrated, and we had Muslim Brotherhood working together with Protestant Christians and so on and so forth. But the reality is, we have to acknowledge that since the 50s up until now, we had 50 years of Ba'ath rule. 40 years were dominated by the Assad family, and we have a methodical indoctrination of minority groups in Syria, basically, and also of the Sunni community in Syria by different forces. And we had a lot of basically changes in terms of how we feel about the country, who we are as a people, and the issue of development also in our country have really been sort of going up and down for a while, and over the last 20 years it's been sort of like in a downturn for a long time. I think the identity of the modern Syrian is very broken. There is this vague sense of belonging to a country, but beyond that there is a lot of confusion about so many things. When you hear the regime propaganda, it's really very much reminiscent of fascist propaganda. It's as if Goebbels is speaking really to the Syrian people at this stage. But it's not to the Syrian people, it's to the minority groups. There is a lot of indoctrination, there is a lot of playing on the fear and stoking of the sectarian fires. And I think to the point where when you have a sniper with a rifle on the top of a building, he knows that's a child, he knows this is an unarmed child, and yet he's willing to shoot. I mean, you really have to wonder what kind of hatred his mind has been filled with, what kind of lies. But, when you are dealing with this kind of situation, and when you have a regime that's capable of manipulating the fears of certain segments of the populations and stoking them with hatred and filling them with lies and taking sort of several very legitimate issues about their role in society and transferring that into an element of control, into an element of manipulation, into an element of hatred, then we are really definitely facing a situation where civil war is very much a real prospect in our future. We cannot keep referring to the 1950s except as a reminder that things were better and we could probably go back there and learn a few lessons. But the realities on the ground are right now is that we are a heavily sectarian society. The Alawite, the Christians and the Jews are not thinking as Syrians at this stage, but mostly they're sectarian, or even as leftists or members of the Communist Party or Ba'ath Party or whatever. They're thinking as if their identity is the political party and is the thing that they should advocate. There is an existential crisis the regime has created, and it's been manipulated continuously, day and night, through the propaganda machine of the regime and through its agents on the ground. And I think this is really what's creating this ability of the regime to behave with impunity, because the regime doesn't give a damn about what the Syrian people in general think. It gives a damn about what the segments from which it derives its support think. And as long as they think along the lines that it wants, then this is perfect for it. So we are really dealing with realities, with a broken sense of identity, with realities that are very much paving the ground for some kind of a civil mayhem. The protesters and their leaders on the ground have been immensely wise and immensely brave and immensely intelligent in their ability to not be dragged into a sectarian conflict. For a while, 2 months ago, the regime spoke about sectarian clashes and Homs and some incidents and people getting killed and targeted. And all of a sudden, now that the tanks are in the street, we don't hear that anymore. So it seems to me these events and news were manufactured so that the regime can introduce these tanks into the city and justify the atrocities it's committing there. But the reality is, we do not see this pattern continuing. Had this been a real pattern, I think we would have been witnessing right now clashes in many different communities around Homs. We would have seen sort of like Sunnis going into an Alawite village and committing atrocities or anything along these lines. But we are not seeing that. The reality is, the protesters, even though the majority of them are Arab Sunnis, they really don't think of their revolution along these terms. They refuse to think of this revolution along these terms. And despite occasional lapses in rhetoric, and despite the fact that sectarian prejudices are real, but you have a protest movement that's trying to rise above the prejudice, that's trying to say, look, we know we have a problem, we don't necessarily are acting out of complete and sincere acceptance of the other, but we're acting out of a sense that we have no other choice. We are together. We need to find a solution to our problems. So the protest leaders so far have really been smart, savvy, moral, and ethical. But the problem is, time is not on their side if they are not supported in the right way. If the international community doesn't provide support to the Free Syrian Army, doesn't provide support to the protest movement, doesn't change its current stance. What you said is very disconcerting for me. Because yes, you're right, the American government now is going into election mode. The French are going into election mode. Other EU countries are in let's save our asses, our economy is faltering, and the Arab League cannot be counted on to do anything. So we are being left alone. This is now an internal situation, and we need to find a way to manage it until the conditions on the international scene change and allow for a